everybody. I want to welcome you to another installment for this channel, touching on issues of international relations, history, and politics. My name is Joseph Lugo, and I'm welcoming you here today. As I mentioned in the last episode, I wanted to touch on some issues that would be both more controversial and more critical and complicated. Those being mass shootings, the second being the war in Ukraine, and we will touch on the economics as well, current state of the economy. But before I do any of those things, I wanted to impart to you where I'm coming from. So my knowledge regarding democracy, its form and function, as well as its relationship to its people. So what I want to focus on, namely, is something that we don't really talk about anymore. Namely, the fact that while we celebrate the existence of democracy to protect our rights and freedoms and promote those things as well, that while those are very important and extremely crucial to democracy, they are one side of the coin. Essentially, that democracy is not, that is in its form is a balanced government. Not just freedom and rights, but also the promotion and protection of the rule of law. Without one, you cannot have the other. So I'm going to get in just a little bit. I'm going to touch on the reasoning that I have behind that. So this is a website from the Library of Congress regarding the Magna Carta and its connection to the Constitution of the United States. So all links to everything I'll be showing here will be in the description as well. Before I get into that, I want to touch on a background of the Magna Carta, which was from 1215 AD. It was essentially a declaration stating the limited power of the king, that the king did not have all power. This was in England at the time. That the king was not above the rule of law. That essentially the citizens were not ruled by men, but that men were ruled by the law, even the king himself. So there's one tract here of law, establishing a rule of law. The first rule being that no one is above it. The other concept that comes along with this is the belief in that same period of time in the promotion of gathering parliaments or legislatures. Now, that has actually a even larger history from, the beginning of maybe 200 AD all the way up to, coming to completion in the Age of Enlightenment, 17th, 18th, 19th century toward the end. So basically the establishment of all over the world, really, and I'm not going to get into all the countries, but they include those in Europe, in the Middle East. Some will argue that they pop up in Asia as well. Basically, throughout that very large period of time, that both temporary and more permanent structures for legislatures were created. Some were legislative in function, others were simply deliberative bodies given the power to appoint officials or declare certain policies. But you see the development of those things all the way through centuries. And it's kind of proto-parliamentarian. And as time goes forward, these things become more refined, more power given to them, which continues both the diffusion of power from the king and the establishment of a structure or a rule or a structure of government that would promote that nobody was above the law. So going back to this website, I'm going to quickly just read a section of this. So this paragraph explains the how crucial the Magna Carta is to the United States government, but it really is crucial to the development of democracy all over the world. So, but I'll just address this perspective right now. So reading this paragraph here, it says the Magna Carta exercised a strong influence both on the United States Constitution and the constitutions of various states. However, its influence was shaped by what 18th century Americans believed Magna Carta to signify. Magna Carta was widely held to the people's reassertions of rights against an oppressive ruler, a legacy that captured American distrust of concentrated political power. In part because of this tradition, most of the state constitutions, including Declaration of Rights, intended to guarantee individual citizens a list of protection and immunities from the state government. The United States also adopted the Bill of Rights, in part due to this political conviction. So, what the trend that you begin to see in the development of democracy is the concept of preserving individual rights, but also preserving the rule of law. Basically, that no one is above the law. And in doing that, you're enshrining these two tracks of democratic government. So the Magna Carta, nowadays, it's kind of falls into this one side. I believe it's a one-sided narrative of individual rights and freedom, that this is the beginning of the diffusion of power to the people, which is all very true and all very crucial for democracy. But I like to think of democracy as a coin with two sides. Without one, you can't have the other. It's a balanced approach to government. Now, different democracies in the world have different forms of accomplishing these two tasks: preserving individual rights versus promoting the rule of law to protect those rights. The basic function of government is the security of its people and the rule of law. Now, part of that, and then obviously the other side of that is preserving individual rights, preserving freedoms. Britain does it with an unwritten constitution, a number of fundamental laws that outline these things. The United States does it through separation. Britain does have a form of separation of powers too, but the United States has a separation of enumerated powers from a written constitution, given each of these branches specific powers written in a specific document, which gives it checks and balances. One power versus another. No one can gain kind of ultimate power in this situation. But the point is, democracies throughout the world follow these two tracks. The narrative that we hear now is all about freedom. It's all about individual rights. It's all about my choice, my individual rights. What the citizen is empowered to do. And as fundamental to democracy as that is, the history of democracy, I think, is not being fully disclosed in the modern world. You get that through certain sources, through certain educational sources, certain organizational sources, but in the popular media, it's all about one side, freedom, and not enough attention is paid to the rule of law. So in particular, I'm gonna shift gears here and go to the Federalist Papers. Now, the United States creates a form of government with three distinct powers enumerated and described in a single constitutional document, given specific powers in that document. And the concept is that one balances the other. So these Federalist Papers were written, many of them to argue for the existence of a constitution, its purpose, its motive, what it's for. And what I'm going to go ahead and start with is Federalist 9. This one was written by Alexander Hamilton. Now, it's crucial here. He's talking about the separation of powers. And in this, he'll talk about broad, but what I want you to pay attention to as well is kind of broad concepts of the balance of power as well as the the rule of law. So I think I'm going to start on the second paragraph here. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. Or maybe it's the third paragraph. Yes, here it is. All right. The regular distribution of power into distinct departments, the introduction of legislative branches and checks, the institution of courts composed of judges holding their offices during good behavior, the representation of the people in the legislature by deputies of their own election. These are wholly new discoveries, or have made their principal progress towards perfection in modern times. They are means and powerful means by which excellences of republican government may be retained and its imperfections lessened or avoided. So Hamilton, in particular to U.S. democracy, is talking about the separation of powers and the importance that those have in maintaining a balance of power. And this balance of power, in turn, feeds on the protection of rights of its people and vice versa. And then he begins to quote Montesquieu from The Spirit of Laws. And let me just go down. I think it's the 10th paragraph. So, if a single member, this is Hamilton quoting Montesquieu, if a single member should attempt to usurp the supreme authority, he could not be supposed to have an equal authority and credit in all Confederate states. Were he to have too great influence over one, this would alarm the rest. Where he is to subdue a part, that which would still remain free might oppose him with forces independent of those which he had usurped and overpower him before he could be settled in his usurpation. So that's exactly what I was saying earlier. In the United States, essentially, if there's too much power being gathered in one section of government, the other sections will assert their own authority, in keeping in mind that they know that this usurpation or abuse of power has to be balanced out. So this is what you see in the two tracks. At least in the United States, the promotion of freedom is directly linked to the government and the rule of law. So there is the ultimate sovereignty of the people, but that goes through the rule of law and the Constitution through the three branches of government. This is why it's indirect democracy, or republican government in the classical term, or the Enlightenment term, I should say. So what that means is we elect our officials in those capacities to represent us through the constitutions, which gives the power of elections in order to do that. This is why, obviously, voting is so crucial to any democracy. It really is an embodiment of an exercise of the rule of law to pick representatives, and which is an ultimate function, which is a crucial singular function of government. Next, what I want to do is, this is the point that I really want to drive home. This is Federalist 10 from James Madison. And what you're going to see here is an argument that Madison's going to make in defense of the United States Constitution. But what you're going to see is reflections of this argument all the way back, probably in the 17th century, from John Locke and others, regarding the security agreement that democracy is. If everyone is left to their own devices and there is no law, there's pure freedom, everyone can do what they want, then everybody is in danger from the one person that abuses power, the one person that decides that in order to gain ascendancy or to gain control, he's going to steal or murder or oppress other people. In a world without law and where everyone is perfectly free, everyone is in danger from that one or person or that one group of people. So what happens here is therefore nobody is really everybody may technically be perfectly free, but nobody's safe. So you see that in Locke, in arguments for the creation of government, and in other groups. Madison is this is going to be the U.S. version, really, of this argument, but it's an argument that's reflected in all of democratic government. People get together, they create a civil society, and they create a government to essentially give a little bit of their sovereignty in order to protect themselves, in order to protect a sort of rule of law, to actually promote some sort of rule of law that will maintain some sort of sphere of their freedom. It would protect their life, it would protect their property, and it would protect them from the oppression of others. That is what democracy is. It's number one. I want to. It's you can call it a security agreement, but it really is a construct by which people can maintain their freedom through the rule of law. And how Madison is going to couch this in the form of the U.S. government. Now, obviously, I'm from the U.S., so I'm going to use these as examples. But going back to John Locke and Rousseau, and who was later, and Hobbes, these kind of democratic theorists, I guess, from the very beginning, that would be a whole series, and we may come back to that someday at some point, but I'm not going to cover it right now. Essentially, what you see is, but the other part that I want to stress before I read this is that this isn't just theory, right? We see this as reality. We see it as a reality of history, right? You have the one person who gains too much power, or the one group of people who gains too much power. We see this all throughout history, in the 20th century and before. And there's no law to stop him. There's no one to stand up to him or her, or to him or a group of people. Usually it's a him. And it becomes this, it gets out of control, essentially, because what we have is human beings, it's their nature to gain power, and then when they get too much power, obviously the corruptive properties of that power begin to take over. And obviously no one is protected from evil men who abuse power. So that's the other part of it. So in this particular instance, we'll see Madison begin to talk about faction, and exactly what I was talking about earlier. But this isn't just, I want you to keep in mind as I read this is not just a theory. I want you to listen. We can listen to this and conjure up all sorts of historical examples. Probably more than one in the history of humanity. So we'll go here. So this, he's talking about the government protecting against faction. These must be chiefly and not wholly effects to the unsteadiness and injustice with which a factious spirit has tainted our public administration. By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So, why this is very interesting to me. Madison doesn't come out and say a faction is this kind of group and a faction does this kind of thing. He says, essentially, because this definition is so broad, my understanding is that a faction can be anything. It can be one person. It can be a group of people. It can be a group of people who have the right cause but act in the wrong way. It could be a group of people that is totally antithetical to democracy and simply wants to oppress people or murder them. It can be a group of people who don't have the right motivation, but end up somehow thinking that don't have the right motivation, but somehow think that they can do the right thing. And it's kind of a reverse example of somebody who has good motivations and ends up doing the wrong thing. A faction can be anything that's inverse to liberty or the rule of law. And the next paragraph here, there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. The one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. There are again two methods of removing the causes of faction. One by destroying the liberty which is essential to his existence. The other by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. And it's in this first one, he says, it could never be more truly said than the first remedy, it was worse than a disease. So he says people are it's the nature of humans to gather together to want what they want. And at times, if it gets out of control, they can become a faction if they think they can take away from other people's liberty to promote their own, to kind of, no, I shouldn't say take away, but rob other people's liberty to promote their own goal. And this is, he says, we see this all the time. We have seen it in history. We've seen the worst examples of humanity trying to promote a positive cause, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe their evil causes are blatant for the world to see, but they are intent on conquest and force to gain those goals. So it could be anything, but he says trying to completely stop liberty in order to stop faction is not going to work. In fact, it may cause worse outcomes than you are trying to promote or than you're trying to prevent. So he goes on, the second one is giving everyone the same opinion is unwise, unproductive, and impossible. So here's the crucial thing I want to take away here. So it says let me go ahead and just follow along. The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. And we see them everywhere, brought into different degrees of activity, according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well of speculation as of practice, an attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interested in the human's passion, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. Does any of this sound familiar yet? I guess is my question. So, and going through this, it says so this is basically the way people are, essentially. Now, he's not necessarily saying that people are only this way and that they don't have any potential for good. But I think he's saying that we have too many historical examples of the abuse of power to simply take people's word for their bargains or their agreements or what they state their actions are going to be. So this is the crucial statement here. The inference to which we are brought, basically the conclusion that we have to come to, is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is to be sought only in the means of controlling its effect. This is democracy. Now, he goes on to explain the particular way it's done in the United States, but all sorts of governments, all sorts of democratic governments all over the world have different ways of accomplishing this, and they are still democracies. So that's essentially what government is. That's essentially what democratic government is. Its goal is not to destroy freedom or to create chaos, but it's a balance to drive or steer people's personal motivations to a greater cause. In the United States, we are seeing a period of more factious parties and greater political contention. We have seen that in the past. It's always been an ebb and flow situation, although I doubt, people breaking in to the Capitol is something that we have seen in any recent time. Or the fact that there are greater, riots in the streets over certain situations, giving an excuse to criminals to do, harm to property in a city and whatnot. The point is that we're seeing greater faction here. We're seeing people promoting their own cause and the desire to rob other people's freedom in order to accomplish that. To create by force what has not been justified by law. So, but what democracy is the attempt to channel, the attempt to guide personal motivations into a greater good. In the United States, basically, we have a method for this, and it's worked for 200 years. Now, you can argue that there have been occasions where drastic action needed to be taken because we were in extremely drastic situations. And obviously there have been, as George Washington said, a number of the extremities of our government have changed dramatically and have come to a greater motive of other things in society compared to when it was created. But the principles at the fundamentals of U.S. democracy are still the same. The Constitution is still legitimate. And despite the flaws, the great flaws of the people who created it, the compromise that they produced, the product that came out of this, is something that has lasted for over 200 years, is something that's solid, and I believe we should support. It's something that demands not just the cohesiveness of political party, not just ideological tests of purity, but it actually demands that to get something done, you actually have to debate something in its fullness. That there'll be disagreements, there'll be fights, there'll be arguments. This is part of the process. But the ultimate goal is to produce a policy. And you cannot produce a policy any other way in the United States and in many other democracies. The method is different, but I would argue that the purpose and the point is still the same. But you cannot complete a policy any other way without hammering out an actual policy, a bill that comes from that rigorous debate and ultimately some compromise. There has to be a recognition of a greater good, a rule of law, or freedom will wither. And that's the point that I kind of wanted to make to you today. And that's the point that I want you to keep in mind as we move forward with some of these much more complicated issues. Because it's the context, it's the structure by which I approach these kinds of things. So that's what I wanted to offer you today. If you disagree, if you want more discussion, there may be follow-up series on this as I touch on other parts of the Federalist Papers. All of these will be linked in the description that you will be able to access. And please, if you feel differently, if you agree, however you feel, you can leave a comment in the post, and obviously your view will be welcome. So I want to thank you for listening, for watching, and hopefully that's the backdrop by which we can move toward greater knowledge and more effective action. Thank you.